Great. Okay, so as I said, I'm Lynn Jimison, the chair, the current chair, and I'm handing over to Samuel, who's just going to make some introductory remarks. I mean, the event is going to be, we hope, quite interactive, and we hope that there'll be a dialogue with the audience. But Samuel's going to make some introductory remarks and introduce the two speakers.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thanks also to our guests, of course, Almut Rochowanski and Dr. Vladimir Korica for being here to share their insights this evening. Almut Rochowanski is a feminist activist and non-resident fellow with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and Dr. Unkovski-Korica is a senior lecturer in international and political studies at the University of Glasgow. My name's Samuel. I work on the campaigns and communications for Scottish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Today's a very significant and solemn anniversary, marking 4 years of war between Russia and Ukraine. Scottish CND has hosted online events on this day every year since the Russian invasion in 2022, and it feels shocking to mark a fourth anniversary of this ongoing conflict. It feels as if this event has become a normalized fixture of our yearly life cycle, with no clear prospect of being able to celebrate a resolution and peace at this stage. Barring intermittent small breakthroughs by Ukrainian and Russian forces, by most assessments, this conflict has been more or less frozen for some time now, though the cost in human lives clearly remains very high. Since February 2025, when we had our last webinar, however, there has been what is potentially the most optimistic breakthrough to date in terms of diplomacy, with the proposal of a somewhat sketchy 28-point plan for ending the war by the US government in November last year. Since then, however, amid various counter-proposals and meetings between US, Russian, Ukrainian, European leadership, there does not seem to have been a very much substantive progress made towards ending the fighting within the past 3 to 4 months. And the status of the putative peace negotiations um, will form part of our discussion tonight. But if you'll excuse a more personal reflection, perhaps in the run-up to this event, I found myself thinking a lot about the young Ukrainian and Russian men of around my age, so many of whom have died, been maimed, psychologically scarred by war. Some of them may have been on the front lines several times by now. Many of them conscripted to fight and kill and die against their will. And I've been thinking about these men and their families. I've been trying to imagine myself in their position and trying to imagine how they want this war to end. For example, would a mother or father with two sons in the Ukrainian army sign on to territorial concessions, for instance, in order to have those sons home safe? Would a mother or father who already lost two sons in this war sign on to territorial concessions, for instance, to end the fighting? It's impossible to know just from a thought experiment what such people hope and desire. But my point is not to assume what Ukrainian and Russian people want or don't want, but simply to point out that here in the UK, we hear very, very little about the desires and rationales of those people in our national conversation about the Ukraine war. Instead, we hear primarily from political and military elites who present war as necessary and inevitable, with barely any acknowledgement of the cosmic suffering that this war has produced over the past 4 years. So hopefully our discussion tonight can challenge that kind of thinking and at least try and envisage what peace in Ukraine could look like. Um, I'll hand over to Scottish CND Chair Lynn Jameson, who's already introduced herself, who will moderate the rest of the webinar. I just want to give a reminder that as our guests Almut and Vladimir are speaking, we really welcome questions from our audience members, which you can put in the chat in advance, and we can invite you to speak directly as well if you so wish, because as Lynn said, we do want this to be an interactive session. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Samuel. Um, could you or Christina please send Isabel Lindsay the link? She's having trouble getting in.
I shall.
Thank you. And right, so just following on from Samuel's remarks, we thought we'd just start by asking a pretty general question of I think Almut and Vladimir, but I think maybe this one Almut is more able to answer to start us off. And this question is maybe one that some members of the audience might want to also kind of come in on, but given that both Alma and Vladimir have got quite strong connections with people living in Ukraine and indeed in Russia, we thought we would start by asking what they know about what people are thinking at the moment in Ukraine about the situation. Alma, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of reporting this past year, and especially the last month through this winter, which has been, particularly hard, ruinously hard, that the mood in Ukraine has changed a lot, and that more and more Ukrainians are saying that they are tired of war, and especially that they're worried that if the war continues, there will be nothing left of their country and their society. The responses in the polls have also changed. So they've now been for quite some while solid majorities for a peace deal. And depending on how these questions are asked, these Ukrainians would even consent to conditions, like especially territorial conditions. But then sometimes they're asked differently and then they don't consent. And of course, I think the biggest debate that has sort of erupted is one of those is like, who actually gets to speak for Ukrainians? Who are legitimate Ukrainian voices? Many of those who've claimed for themselves that they're speaking for Ukrainians, they're either not in Ukraine or they are not on the front or they're not directly affected by the war. And generally they belong to the elites. We haven't heard from poor people, rural people, displaced people, refugees, and how they might desire an end for the war. But they're often just not heard. So one interesting trend is that previously it was always said, and it was true probably, that veterans, and especially the leading far-right military commanders, would be opposed to a peace deal and would actually actively threaten any leader or Zelensky, who makes a peace deal. And that has very much changed. Like in fall, some of these like leading far-right militant voices who control some of the most elite units have said like, we should make a deal now because otherwise our army will be destroyed like completely. So that is a significant change. Polling in war times is problematic, and it's problematic in Russia and in Ukraine because it's subject to political influence. The polling institutions are. There's also something called social desirability, where people give the answers that they are expected people want to hear. And then also people are afraid of persecution by the state for saying the wrong thing. And that is, of course, very much true in Russia, but it's also true in Ukraine. So polls should be taken with a grain of salt. In Russia, the polls have long shown these pronounced contradictions where high shares of respondents keep saying that they support the war effort. But then at the same time, the same people say, and we would support Putin if he made a peace like right now. So the hardcore proactive war supporters in Russia is estimated by sociologists as maybe 10 to 20% of the population. But the majority have a sort of resigned, matter-of-fact support or just acquiescence, right? They certainly don't feel like they have much of a say. Mainly, it has to be said, though, the war in Russia for most feels very far away. Like most people in Russia lead a life that is not impacted by it at all. I think it's important, though, for us, something that we can see very much, right? And this is how people vote with their feet. So again, last year in 2025, we saw a higher number of Ukrainians leaving Ukraine. Part of this was the decision by the Ukrainian government to allow young men up to 24 to leave the country. Previously, everybody, all men above 18 had to stay. And so part of another reason why people started leaving was the greater destruction of the energy system and the very cold winter and destruction of housing that followed. Um, but this whole voting with their feet also applies to participation in the war. So Ukraine has had trouble mobilizing men actually for a very long time, pretty much since the start of the war. But at first it wasn't so conspicuous. And if you're someone like me who spends a lot of time in like Ukrainian Telegram channels and others, I've been seeing these videos of forced mobilization. It's also called bussification because men are literally violently pulled into these minivans. I've seen them forever. And then last year, apparently, Western audiences finally caught on to this, although there was a great reluctance, I think, to report on it. And it's been reported more as something that's rare. But most Ukrainians are really surrounded by this. But it's reality that every day, thousands of, like, every day they can see thousands of these, like, I'm not saying there are thousands of incidents every day, but sort of the social media space is full of these videos. Um, the interesting thing about us is that so this process of violent mobilization is often indeed very, very violent. Like men have been beaten, they've been severely injured. There have been cases where people have been killed in the enrollment offices. And what's so interesting about these videos is that in almost all of these videos, you see people running up or ordinary bystanders, maybe their loved ones, maybe their family members, but often just bystanders and very often women of all ages, and like physically fight against these recruitment officers to pull the men back out of these vans. So that's the whole voting with their feet things. In Russia, recruitment of volunteers continues. There has not been forced mobilization since 2022, which went very badly, and then the government stopped doing that. But what they've had to do in recent months is we've seen, this is public information, we've seen that the financial rewards offered for volunteering have once again gone up substantially, and that's an indicator that they have problems finding them. So it seems in Russia, the main motivation seems to be financial and professional incentives. They are in some regions so high that basically it can be seen as a lifetime opportunity to lift yourself and your family out of poverty. But I have to say, exploiting people's poverty or financial trouble, like forgiving their debt or something, that is a form of state violence too.
Okay. So from what you've said, Almut, it seems like the impression that we get from our own mainstream media is completely wrong. I mean, you get the impression from the mainstream media that the majority of people in Ukraine are still up for fighting a war. But what you're saying about voting with your feet doesn't sound consistent with that.
Well, I mean, I want to say so. I don't want to be completely unfair on the mainstream media. They do occasionally report sort of these like feature stories or human interest stories, like the story of one woman who thinks that the war should be over, or they will report that there's been a new poll that shows a change in attitudes. But those are occasional intermittent coverage, and then the rest of it is very much different. And we should also pay attention to the fact that often our media report on what our politicians say. And our politicians will say that Ukrainians, are want to keep fighting for freedom and for, for us and whatever, and for European values, and they're devoted and they're so admirable. So we're just hearing a lot of that, sort of this echo chamber. But we're
Yeah.
definitely like sort of if you consume Western media and then you sort of spend time in Ukrainian social media spaces or even just Ukrainian media, which are many still surprisingly open, you get completely different impressions. Like it's almost like parallel universes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Does anybody else want to come in onto this particular question?
Shall I just
Yeah,
um,
Vladimir, please.
add a little bit to what Almut was saying? Yeah, no, I mean I agree with what Almut has just told us. The other thing I was going to raise, I think, is that when we look at both countries, there is a bit of a contradictory picture going on, and that is that when we look at the war itself, there is what we might describe as a rough stalemate with Russian forces creeping forward along most of the front. However, I think the intensity of the fighting has remained incredibly high, and that suggests that there's an element of support in both countries for the war effort. It is simply the case that neither side has collapsed. Ooh, sorry, my screen went black for a second there. Sorry. So I was saying that the war effort on neither side has completely collapsed. However, at the same time, when we look at statistics, for example, on the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainian defense minister just in January said there were about 2 million Ukrainians who are actively draft dodging at the moment. That's a very significant number of people when you think about it, and that 200,000 have deserted from the army. Now that's a very high level of essentially, as Almut called it, voting with your feet. I mean, we're not necessarily talking about escaping from the country, but we are talking actively resisting to fight. And I think that probably suggests that the picture is very complex. You know, people will say one thing in an opinion poll, but when it comes to actually doing the fighting, they might not be so keen. And in that kind of framework, I think it's also important to notice that in both countries there's been an increase in the number of people who are quite, shall we say, pessimistic about the future in a sense. With also a majority of Russians very recently saying that they would like to see or they expect to see peace in 2026. And I think that was a kind of state-sanctioned type of poll, which also suggests perhaps that the Russian leadership might be moving in a direction of some kind of deal being done and preparing the public for it. The trouble with that is also that remains a contradictory picture because at the same time we still have statements by leading politicians, including the Russian foreign minister, calling President Zelensky a Nazi. So it's not necessarily the case that it's a simple picture of everyone wanting peace, or indeed everyone wanting war. It seems to me that there is increasing war weariness and expectation that there should be negotiations to end the war on both sides. However, it's also clear that on both sides, the politicians are very reluctant to make significant concessions, and that's maybe something we can talk about when we come to discussing negotiations. But I'll stop there just so that we have more of a discussion.
No, that's great, and we will go on to discuss negotiations. But Jonathan, have you got a question about this issue?
No, no, just a comment, really. I mean, I think the problem is our politicians on both sides, both Zelensky and Putin, and in this country. And I think there's also been, very successful, I think, almost brainwashing in this country about what's going on there. I mean, people generally think, Russia should be beaten. We must support the Ukrainians. So that's also pushing the potential for the war to continue, which isn't really the choice necessarily. And I agree there's sure to be people in Ukraine that want it to continue, and there will be in Russia. But I suspect the bulk of people, it's been horrific. As Samuel was saying at the beginning is so true, utterly horrific, and people don't seem to be able to get that. It's a very simplistic message that was given out. Must be that Russia was completely responsible, which I don't think it was completely. I'm not saying it didn't bear some responsibility. And people just hold on to that and don't really invest. The trouble is nothing comes out in detail about what it's about. And so it's very difficult, I think, and that pushes pressure on to continue the war.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so maybe we should move on to the issue of negotiations. Isabel, no, Isabel, on you go. Can you unmute? Yes, there you
I've
go.
managed now. Apologies for being late. It was a problem in linking in. Have we, I don't know if this has been covered, but have we got, I know it must be very difficult to assess, to measure, but have we any indication of what the kind of mood is in that 20% of territory that Russia now occupies? I mean, is there continued civilian resistance? Is there acceptance? What do we know of the mood there?
Okay, that's an interesting question, Isabel. Almut or
I can venture a few things. So I think territory that has been conquered after fall 2022. So after like in the first year, there was a big movement of back and forth, right? And a lot of territory changed hands. And after that, the conquest has been comparatively slow. And because it is so slow that, and we've seen the images of these like cities, entire cities destroyed into like moonscapes, right? And because of that, the moment it is conquered, there are just not a lot of people left there. So most people would have fled or would have evacuated. A few, especially the elderly, insist on staying. There's even a special term for that in this war and in this context. It's called sort of the waiting people, like they wait for the Russians or something. Um, in the in the territories that used to that Russia sort of like controlled since 2014, although they've been formally next to Russia, like life there and politics there feels different from the rest of Russia. And there have been a lot of stories about how the local sort of militias there are especially like there's especially aggressive or pressured recruitment into them. So like the residents of the Donbass have faced a lot of pressure to participate in this war, to like be drafted or serve. We hear nothing like this in Crimea. Crimea feels a lot more like the rest of Russia. Now, Crimea, of course, has experienced missile attacks and others. So, but that's the last one of those is now quite a while ago. There was sort of resistance, sort of like partisan type resistance, particularly in the south, in the newly occupied territories. We don't hear so much of that anymore. We also heard that it was quite violently repressed and that people that were sort of like people were detained and tortured and sort of typical anti-partisan activity, which always relies on a high degree of sort of human rights violations and terror. We don't, I want to say we don't hear a lot, and that may just be because it is very hard for anyone to go there and report. And that may be it. I can say we've seen, so there are some oddities, like you remember the big city of Mariupol on the Azov Sea, that at the very beginning of the war was, destroyed to a great extent. And this is a very large city. This is much larger than the cities in the Donbass that we've seen destroyed in the last few years. That city has had seen a lot of reconstruction, sort of ostentatious reconstruction. And Russian TV makes a point of showing that sort of as like, look what we do once we arrive, like we build all these new apartment buildings and life is great here. And we've heard that there's even sort of like a mini like real estate boom where like people from all over Russia buy up apartments there. But those are like what it's really then like on the ground is hard to say, like because we just don't know. We just know that Russian TV, like Russian propaganda, tries to showcase this place. It doesn't do that with anywhere else, like in the Donbass, for example.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Isabel, do you want to come back on that or?
No,
Yeah,
that's fine.
this Isabel Lindsay is our vice chair, by the way, of Scottish CND, and we've also on the call got David Kelly, who's our treasurer, just so that you know. Okay, so we'll maybe move on to the next set of questions, which are more about the negotiations. So we wondered whether Alma and Vladimir, whether you feel that there are real peace talks taking place at the moment, and whether since the thing that got called the 28-point plan that was proposed by the United States in 2025, there has been any real progress, and what a just peace maybe would look like, in and how does that compare with what's feasible and plausible? So these are sort of quite big issues about negotiation and the state of them. I wonder, and we're not expecting you to, know all the answers to this, but maybe you could sort of make some comments, please.
Maybe Vladimir could go first this time. Do you have to unmute him?
Sorry, yeah, I was just I seem to have destroyed my buttons at the bottom, so I couldn't find the unmute button. Yes, thank you. I mean, I think maybe it's a good idea to point you to an article which I read this morning on the Substack of Ivan Kachanovsky. He's an academic of Ukrainian background in working in Canada at the moment. I seem to be unable to copy paste at the moment. Sorry, my technical abilities are sometimes really great, but I'll get there in a minute. But the overall sensation that you do get is that there has been quite a lot of discussion in the background. Shuttle diplomacy, including Trump's special envoy. And several Russian and Ukrainian, especially designated appointees for this purpose. So there is much more back-channel discussion than there had been in any obvious sense under Biden. So there is a clear, I think, shift under the Trump presidency, which did lead to some kind of open documents being published for the first time since the April 22 negotiations. How far these are real and how much they're pretending a breakthrough, I find very difficult to tell, and maybe Almut will have her own views on this, and others maybe in the room. But some of the things I wanted to underline are just the kind of public messaging that we're getting. A lot of the public messaging, as far as I can tell, over the last 2 or 3 months has been very negative on both sides. I mean, as I just mentioned about Ivanov, who
Vlad, your microphone's dropping out a little bit. Can you maybe?
Sorry, yeah, no. I mean, I'm in the
into it?
office, and it does this sometimes in the world-class infrastructure that we're promised at the university. Sorry. So hopefully that's me back.
Yeah.
I was just suggesting that the foreign minister of Russia was the other day calling Zelensky a Nazi, and as we know, one of the calls in the initial phases of what Russia called the special military operation was precisely denazification. So if you're saying that, you're pretty much saying that you do not wish to deal with the leadership of Ukraine as currently constituted. Similarly, when we look at Ukraine's responses to a lot of what has been published as the proposed settlement between the United States and Russia, there's a high level of contrarian positioning. So the 20-point peace plan reproposed by Ukraine and the European Union leadership got rid of mentions of things like neutrality and NATO from it, which is a key Russian demand. And moreover, when discussing European Union membership, the Ukrainian leadership, for example, today was demanding a date, setting a date for Ukrainian membership of the EU in 2027. Now, as anyone who has followed even superficially European Union integration in the last 30 years in Eastern Europe, you would know that such quick accelerated entry into the European Union and all its demands to adopt legislation and standards, etc., make this demand highly, I would say, suspect. I mean, I don't think anyone, including Zelensky himself, could believe that the Ukraine could be that the Ukrainian state could be so quickly integrated. So I think there's a lot of positioning which suggests that neither side is seriously contemplating significant changed in significant concessions in the negotiations. However, I would also say that it is also clear that given the state of affairs, there has been movement. Just the fact that they're talking, just the fact that, for example, Trump did do things like switching off intelligence to Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region, after which they collapsed within days. That kind of activity, also tariffs on Russia, etc., do suggest that he's trying in a serious way to nudge both sides to some kind of agreement. But fundamentally, I think that when we look at the situation, to put it in a nutshell, what we're seeing is some kind of bilateral discussion between Washington and Moscow, and on the other hand, what is best perhaps described as rearguard action by Kiev, supported by the European Union, to frustrate a US-Russia axis. Within this, I find it very difficult to see an imminent breakthrough in negotiations. However, over time, we could see the United States switching off more intelligence, or Russia making a military breakthrough, which might very quickly change the cards in the negotiations. So I'll stop there and see what Alma has to say as well.
So I would say that these peace talks are real in the sense that they are actually happening and ongoing. It's like it's almost a furious effort. I read a really good article today, which just is out on the Carnegie Endowment's website, but I think for now only in Russian. It probably will be translated. And it made the point that these negotiations have now gone on for practically a year, and they've acquired this quality like the war that they just go on and on and on. And of course, peace processes that go on for years, seemingly without progress and with a lot of frustration, that is actually something that those of us who've been in this world longer remember as being normal. Like this is something that happens a lot. It's frustrating, but it's not abnormal in itself. They haven't broken down for good yet. That's something. These negotiations are in many ways just completely deficient. We don't know what exactly is going on. The public isn't being informed, but from what we know, which is already part of the problem, right? But from what we know, we can say that the structure and the framework of these negotiations are highly unusual. Let's put it that way. They seem very ad hoc, very improvised. There seem to be no like serious technical working groups. Well, at times there are, but at times they're not. They also seem to have a problem with basic note taking, because sometimes positions by ones that one side has already put in there is then ignored or forgotten. So it's not very functional. I do think that the Trump administration is very serious about ending this war. They just have a wrong idea of what that means. But they would like this thing out of this world. Like they don't need this, right? I think the constellation that we're having is just very odd and not conducive to peacemaking. So normally you would need, for peace negotiations to start, something called a mutually hurting stalemate, where both sides have nothing to gain and much to lose from continuing the fight. And then, the stadium is called ripening, and then they actually go on to talk. But we don't have that, because Russia is making progress against what we must assume are its aims, which is the destruction of Ukraine's ability to defend itself. And the Ukrainian government also prefers to keep fighting. So what makes this constellation so odd is that Ukraine can only continue this fight with foreign financial support, which by now covers all of the country's civilian administration and buys most of the weapons. So the war effort as such is completely dependent on foreign support as well. US financial support has actually been cut for the most part, and that's a big deal. So the US, the country that most eagerly wants to end the war, has oddly given up much of its leverage before it has achieved that goal. The Europeans, I am shattered and disgusted to say, but our European elites, pretty much across the continent with a few exceptions, clearly want the war to continue. Their actions have been aimed at either spoiling the negotiation effort, or generating support for Ukraine to keep fighting. All last year, and again in recent weeks, we have heard from our European representatives, very much also in the UK, that the war must not end without Russia being defeated, and that Ukraine can and should keep fighting for several more years. They have not explained how Ukraine fighting a few more years accomplishes the goal of defeating Russia, because every day Ukraine loses a bit more. So the conclusion is maybe they're just trying to buy time, although I am not sure for what. I have some ideas, but they seem almost too terrible to spell out. So a just peace at this point, where we are at with Russia and Ukraine in the world, is almost like it's like a mood exercise, right? It would be a fantasy. Now, a just peace would entail full restoration of everything Ukraine has lost, with compensation, possibly also trials for the crime of aggression and war crimes. And a just peace would also importantly center people affected by this war and ask them what they need to be restored and what they need to be compensated for. Because I don't think any of the governments involved are paying attention to their citizens' interests. But this is a fantasy. It's not available, and there's nothing we can do to make this a reality. So if we talk about the just peace today, we have to balance the feasible with justice. And I've been thinking about this and writing about this also the last months, that the best way to do a just and feasible peace would be to bring back people-centered peace practices. So, for example, one of the big deadlocks or stalemates in the current negotiation is the issue of the last sliver of like Donbas territory that is controlled by Ukraine. It contains some cities and some fortifications. And Russia has basically said, we want you to hand that over. And of course, that is completely intolerable and unpalatable for the Ukrainians. But this is one of the big blocks that are holding up peace. And so because it holds up peace, every day there's not a peace, there's a huge cost imposed on Ukraine for every day at war. And making this territory into a zero-sum issue where either one side has to give up or the other one has created this deadlock. And so it would be useful to break up these problems into their components and find solutions, sort of like a third solution, a non-zero-sum solution, one that is based perhaps on the safety and interests of the people that actually live in this region. And this has indeed been suggested, like there's been talk of a demilitarized zone or a free economic zone. And that's a start, but I think it's not quite creative enough. If the negotiators were able to see this problem not in hard binary terms, but maybe like a softened or blurred or shared form of sovereignty, then that could be a way out of a deadlock. But indeed, there's been lots of conflicts around the world that have been solved or ended because of solutions like this. And a very famous one would be Northern Ireland's Good Friday Agreement, right? And we're not seeing that. And again, I think the fact that we're not seeing it is because these negotiations are so deficient.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Almut. And they're partly maybe deficient because of the people conducting them, or don't seem to have
absolutely, yes.
Yeah, don't have any skills in this. They have no track record or skills in conducting such negotiations, really. Does anyone else want to come in on this particular part of the conversation?
If not, maybe I could just throw something else in, which I forgot to mention and might be worthwhile discussing, and that is Trump's national security strategy published at the end of last year, which I think gives us a clue as to what the American administration is thinking, and really tells us a lot about the balance of forces in world politics at the minute. One of the things that's been obvious from Trump's second coming and from statements made by Marco Rubio himself, but now enshrined in the national security strategy, is the view that the United States has overreached as an imperial power, and in a sense that one of its continuing priorities in world politics is competition with China, right? The United States is declining, Europe in particular is declining, so the collective West is declining in world affairs, whereas China is on the rise. And a lot of the preoccupation in the American establishment is what to do about this. And I think a lot of what they're thinking about when they look at Ukraine should be seen through that prism, really. I don't think that, either the Democrats or the Republicans, as parties of big capital and US empire, particularly interested in the welfare of Ukrainians, just as they're not particularly interested in the welfare of ordinary people in their own state, really. But when we look at what they are preoccupied with, they're thinking in grand strategic terms. And Trump's story, in Marco Rubio's words, is to do a reverse Nixon. So when Nixon was president of the United States during the Cold War, he famously, of course, managed to win, as it were, China away from the Soviet Union, and in that way perform a major diplomatic coup in Cold War terms, right, to split the communist bloc as the Americans would see it. And what Marco Rubio says the US is all about is trying to prize Russia out of any nascent Chinese camp in a new Cold War. So what they're really about, in effect, is trying to come to some kind of accommodation with Moscow. And I'm sure that those in Moscow are looking at this and thinking there is an element of advantage here that they would like to be able to balance between East and West and not become too dependent on China. However, they're also looking at the way that Trump has been dealing with world affairs. They've seen how erratic he is, and I don't think that they trust either him or the American leads to keep to a deal. They have been sending signals about red lines for the last 30 years about NATO expansion and so on, and they've been ignored. So I think what's going on, in a way, is that there's a major negotiation between Washington and Moscow on the one hand. And then what we're seeing with the Europeans is that spoiling game that Almut talked about, their absolutely horrific record in this story, which has seen them trying to frustrate the United States from, in a sense, doing a deal with Moscow, because that would see their own relationship with the United States diminished. That is, I think, something that they're incredibly afraid of, and I think that perhaps can also set us up for a discussion about what we really need to be doing. Because if we're guided by the state interest of all these actors, then we're not really going to see just peace at all. What we need to be thinking about is what ordinary people would need, how they can make decisions. And then, I agree with Almut. A just deal would lead to restoration of Ukraine pre the invasion, but it should also, I think, give everyone the right to make decisions about their own future, including if they wish to secede from Ukraine, which may indeed be the case in, for example, Crimea. But none of these things is possible if we have governments that are bent on competing with each other and fighting for great power status in world affairs. So I think really what we're talking about is the need for a kind of mass peace movement on a scale that we saw perhaps around Palestine in the collective Western world, but never really over Ukraine. And I think this is a major question as to why that is the case. Perhaps that's something we can discuss.
Isabel.
Yes,
Please.
just a couple of points. I mean, I think one of the most discredited performances, if one can call it that, in this whole war has been the European one. And we had a comment just fairly recently in the House of Lords by a retired, very senior, former military, top military in the UK. And he said in his speech, just as a kind of throwaway line, it is in the UK's interest to keep this war going. The rest of them aren't quite as crude. But this is the trouble, because this is the best way, as they see it, of undermining Russia, of minimizing a threat or supposed threat or whatever. So this has been the problem with much of Europe. And it is shameful to say that one has to give Trump some credit that we're even in the business of negotiations, because he came in and acted. despite all the horrible things he represents and does. It should have been Europeans being in there at a much, much earlier stage, as it was. Turkey was in there and made a real effort, but that got undermined early on. So the question is, how do we, yes, get that back? And we have been in situations before that looked almost impossible and did last a long, long time, like the Vietnam War, and which went on, and we had so many people in this country and many parts of Europe, certainly for a long period of years, saying we have to back the Americans, we can't allow the commies, to take over the South, etc. And so we've been in it before, but then you are right, a peace movement emerged, a strong peace movement emerged here and in the US, and eventually, we did get, and people must look back and say, what was the Vietnam War about again? Since we now have a strong Vietnam, which is quite independent in its positioning in many respects. So it's trying, one of the things which it would be good to get maybe Ukraine to focus on in preparing plans and costings for how it rebuilds the infrastructure that has been destroyed. Kind of focus and saying we're going to, whatever happens, we're going to have to rebuild so much that has been destroyed, particularly in energy infrastructure. Who's going to commit to doing this? Who's going to help us finance this? To get that emphasis on reconstruction kind of as one of the important focuses.
Thanks, Isabel. Okay, so I think that does take us on to our last set of questions, which is a focus on what we should be doing as a peace movement, what we could do as a peace movement in Scotland, what we could do to highlight the benefits of peace rather than war, for Scotland, for the world, for Ukraine in particular. Jonathan, come in.
Yeah, I think Isabel's point just is brilliant. And I think what we need to do is to start changing changing the whole way people are thinking about this. Because instead of, we should be saying to government, what we should be thinking about is how do we reconstruct Ukraine? Not how we continue the war. And it's the same as in terms of here, we need money that needs to go into social care and hospitals, not into the military. But also in terms of Ukraine, poor Ukraine has been battered to death. It was already economically struggling before this war happened. And that's where the funding should be going into, not into increasing weaponry and not increased provocation, which is what they're doing at the moment. Hope that's helpful in some way.
Yeah, no, of course.
It's very difficult though, because
Yeah.
as I said at the beginning, I think that a lot of our problem has been that the media has, and people have, if you like, the media's very much been one side. It hasn't given a real honest, as it doesn't in lots of like it hasn't in Palestine. But the same thing, there's not enough of honesty. And our politicians also tend to use war. I mean, Johnson did, his attempt to end those the discussions that were going on in Turkey, and the present leadership's following that on. It continues. It's also a way of making them popular. War makes you popular sometimes.
Yep, thank you. Mike, do you want to come in, Mike Martin?
Yeah, I do apologise for being so late. I couldn't find the link and what have you. But yeah, what concerns me is the way in which, and in many ways, Trump has played a blinder. He's managed to get the European countries to continue to fund the proxy war with Russia at the expense of the Ukrainian people. And yes, in the mainstream media, you never hear about the sort of fact that in Lugansk and Donetsk, there's large numbers of people who wanted to determine their own futures because they were being attacked by the post 2014 government in Kiev, and nobody ever talks about this in the British media. It's as if the people of the eastern Ukraine, mainly Russian speakers, have no rights. And this war could be finished very quickly if their security was guaranteed and Ukraine declared itself to be neutral. I mean, were the original demands back in before 24th of February 2022 that Russia put forward to United States and was ignored. So I do think that we need to understand that and respect the fact that the people of eastern Ukraine, the ones who in Lugansk and Donetsk, did not wanted autonomy.
Yeah, Martin, is that
Sorry.
you? Thank you. Vladimir, do you want to come in, please?
Oh, yes. Thanks. I do agree that a lot of this needs to be seen in the way that Mike has just spoken about. But I thought I would just very briefly comment on a broader issue than Ukraine itself, and then bring it back to Ukraine, because one of the things that in the last few years has become a global trend. Apparently, for the first time in 2023, military spending has increased across all the 5 continents in the world. That's an extraordinary thing for us to contemplate. And when Donald Trump took power, yes, he's made quite a song and dance about his ability to resolve a lot of conflicts, and it is the case that there is a sort of ceasefire in Palestine, albeit it is very clearly a bit of a let's call it one-sided kind of ceasefire. He has created an atmosphere in which there is discussion about peace in Ukraine, when that wasn't the case before. But at the same time, he has also increased military spending. He's announced $1.5 trillion for the next US budget for arms spending. That's up more than 50%, I think, and that's an extraordinary figure when you think about it. And as in Chekhov's plays, we're into Russian territory now. If there's a gun in scene 1, it has to be used by scene 3 or act 3. What do you do with all this military spending? And that's the case in Russia and in other countries as well. In Europe, we're seeing massive increases in military spending across the continent. And I think this is a very dangerous dynamic and development. It is very difficult to see how you kind of move away from the brink unless there's a massive reaction from populations themselves. At the moment, when you look at opinion polls across the continent, far right parties are doing a lot of the running as opposition to extreme centre governments, and that's again a very worrying development. So I think it's important for us to discuss where we see peace coming from, and I think that to be honest, when you look at opinion polls in Britain in relation to Ukraine, Britain is among, in a sense, the most belligerent countries on Ukraine. But it is also, when we look at the last 2 years, also been the country with the most massive anti-war movement in relation to Palestine. And I think it is something that we need to kind of use as a lever within the wider peace movement and the labour movement, to bring pressure on the government and to change hearts and minds in this country. In countries like Italy, something like only 32% of people support continuing to arm Ukraine, whereas in this country, it's over half. And I can tell you, as the person who's active in the trade union movement, I mean, just within my own branch, there's increasing polarization over the question of whether we should be discussing rearmament, and a lot of people are saying we should be investing more in the military, and if it means cuts for us, well, that's okay because security. And I think some of the winning arguments need to be made around things that we've won arguments about. The same F-35s that people want to be sending to Ukraine are the ones that have been committing a genocide in Palestine. And more than that, just because we haven't seen nuclear escalation yet doesn't mean that that's off the cards. The longer wars like this rumble on, the more chance there is of an escalation that could lead to catastrophic war. And given we're talking about a CND meeting, I do think that it is pertinent to mention that probably we've been closer to nuclear war than we have been for decades, really, in the past 3 or 4 years. So all of these things, I think, in a way, are things that we should be raising as big arguments. And as the final thought, maybe I'll I don't want to kind of go on here because I know it's almost 8 o'clock and people might wish to get off. But it is the case that a lot of what's been happening relates to Scotland in a big way. I mean, obviously, we have Trident here, and we keep being told that it's important to have Trident. In the words of Nye Bevan, sadly, can we send our foreign secretary into the negotiation room naked? Well, the thing about this is that they keep telling us that Trident and things like this are about our security and they're our nuclear deterrent. But ultimately, they've also admitted very publicly in the last few months that it's not really our deterrent. We can't piss off the Americans, Starmer said, because we depend on them for Trident. Yeah. So, this is not something that Britain controls, and it's all in Scotland. Scottish bases, American bases in Scotland were used to board an American oil tanker on the 7th of January on Christmas Day, Orthodox Christmas Day, which was a hell of an escalation. And we have no say over this whatsoever, right? So all these things are, I think, big reasons for us to make big campaigns and perhaps to echo some of the great movements of the past in Scotland itself, in terms of protesting against American bases in this country, against Trident. And in favor of, welfare, not warfare, because ultimately people will not wish, I think, across Europe to give up their standard of living any further in order to fight wars that appear to be not just going badly, but appear to be destroying the very country they claim to be protecting. So I think these are all big issues for us as a movement, and we have to take them very, very seriously indeed.
Thank you. And Sam, as you pointed out, we are nearly at 8 o'clock. In fact, we're now a minute past, but I'm going to give the last word to Samuel. Samuel.
Thanks. I will be very brief, and thanks to everyone for staying with us for the full hour. I hope that it's been worthwhile. It's certainly been very worthwhile for me. All contributions, both from the audience and from our guests. But I just wanted to thank Vlad for bringing up the nuclear dimension of this. Which is, of course, from the perspective of our campaign, the reason why we've been conducting, doing these webinars on the issue, because this war has been the major flashpoint for potential nuclear escalation since it began. There have been other flashpoints, of course, and for example, between Pakistan and India, and in the Middle East as well. But as Vlad said, this war has brought us closer to nuclear conflict than any point since the Cold War. And another element of this, which I think has changed in this new phase, in this most recent phase of this war, is that we had speeches from the most senior military officials, British military officials, in December, I think it was, talking about war with Russia as inevitable, or in some cases already underway.
Yeah.
And I think that what that shows is that the conventional thinking, ideological premises behind what nuclear deterrence is supposed to do are falling to pieces. Because the notion that the war between two nuclear armed states is inevitable would have been unthinkable a number of years ago. And it shows that the thinking around nuclear weapons is changing. And unfortunately, it's changing in the direction of, um, the necessity for sub-strategic weapons, the necessity for, mixed forms of deterrence, the necessity perhaps even to use smaller scale nuclear weapons as a form of deterrence. So I just wanted to bring that up and highlight the fact that, the whole architecture of nuclear deterrence theory is kind of coming to pieces, I think, as a direct consequence of this war, and it's coming to pieces in a very dangerous way, I think.
Thank you for that, Samuel. I think some of us would maybe say it's coming to pieces more visibly. There's always been a double think. There's always been people who've thought in terms of nuclear war fighting. That's not actually new. There's always been a kind of double script going on, if you like. But yes, it's now more visibly a nonsense, maybe, which is for us a campaigning opportunity. But yeah, we've still got a very long way to go in order to make something like the kind of mass campaign for peace that would maybe help with Ukraine. But anyway, it's good to have that as the inspiration. And thank you so much to both Almut and Vladimir for their contributions and to all of you for being here and being with us and walking with us. And let's just keep the peace hope alive and just keep working as best we can to try to push it in that direction. Thank you.
Can we remind our attendees of the demonstration that we're planning?
Yes, of course.
I'll post the link, folks.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's the
it,
14th of March, and we're running buses to Fastlane from Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Aberdeen, calling at Dundee, Stirling, Perth, down from Aberdeen. You can book on buses. I think it's very important that we renew our commitment to standing outside, by standing outside that base and showing our opposition in the build up to an election. So on the 14th of March, we will be doing that. And I hope you'll all be with us. Thanks again. Thank you.
Thanks again. Thanks, everyone. There's some links in the chat there that you're welcome to save and paste elsewhere.
Yeah, we'll
Include, yeah,
just leave it there a little minute to give people
yes,
a
yeah,
chance
we
to
will.
do cut and paste.
Yeah, Vlad has also posted some important links there.
Yeah, sorry, I just meant to mention it and I forgot, but there is the European Peace Conference in London in June of this year, which is the second one in Europe. The first one was in Paris last year, and there were several thousand people, including trade union delegations from across Europe. So it is, I think, an important thing for us in Scotland to think about and try to tap into. Yeah.
Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you, everybody. Good luck.
Thank you,
Thank
Vlad.
you.
Thank you, Almut, very
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so much.